I don't know what went wrong there, but we are a third time here at chapter 12, Wrestling with Great Problems. On New Year's Day, 1788, Bishop Asbury surveyed an episcopal see as great in area as the continent of Europe outside of Russia. It stretched from Nova Scotia on the northeast to the limits of Georgia on the south, and westward in all directions as far as the overseer might ride or an itinerant might range. Asbury was alone in the administration of this vast charge, his colleague having returned to Europe some time after the conference of 1787. The tour which Asbury now planned for himself was to be twice the length of that of any former year, and was to occupy a period of more than 9 months. A map of the completed journey resembles somewhat the outlines of a mighty hourglass, with its extreme points at New York and the forks of the Broad River in Georgia. 6 conference sittings had been appointed for the year, namely South Carolina, Georgia, Halston, Virginia, Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and Baltimore. Besides these, however, 2 additional sessions were called by episcopal prerogative, one in Philadelphia and one in New York. The first conference was held in Charleston on March 12th, and the last at New York near the 1st of October. Now, there's 3 types of prerogative talked about in a way that the capriciousness is tolerated. There's the women's prerogative. There's the clerical prerogative and the political prerogative. I don't know why it's limited just these 3, but that seems to be the case. Oh, it looks like I have just as much recording time, so I really don't know why it didn't let me keep the last 2. As the bishop left Virginia in midwinter upon the first stage of his tour, the whole state was ablaze with revival. Up to that time, the most remarkable awakening in America under the preaching of the Methodist itinerants, refreshed and fired from contact with the testifying multitudes, to whom he preached as he passed. He went forth to sound the call on the new and ever-changing frontier. His course was over paths that he knew through the Carolinas. Then he crossed the broad savannah and entered into regions both strange and wild. There he rallied the vanguard and sent them forth to spy out the land and set stakes in the virgin soil, leaving in Georgia the handful of pioneer preachers and exhorters who constituted the first Georgia Conference. With his companion and a pack horse, he started across the Blue Ridge and its companion ranges for the romantic lands of the Holston, a region to which his thoughts had often turned. The undertaking was by far the most formidable he had yet faced, but the confidence with which he entered upon it had a vaster stay than that which supported the boast of Napoleon when he said, "There shall be no Alps," encountering the first main axis of the Appalachians. He named it the Mountain of Steel, striking later the escarpments of the Unakas and Great Smokies. He named them the Mountains of Stone and Iron. But once arrived in the historic valley, he found in the home of General Russell, a famous pioneer and soldier, a rest which caused him to forget his toils. There he met the preachers and was blessed with a forevision of what was soon to be in those ultra-montane lands. But of mountain passing he had but begun to have a taste. From the Holston sitting of the conference, he turned his face eastward and crossed the Balsam Range into North Carolina. After holding the Virginia Conference at Petersburg, he turned again northwestward and crossed the Alleghanies into the far-off valley of the Ohio, to which he had sent missionaries as early as 1781. There was now in that isolated field a sufficient work to justify the calling of a conference, and this he did, presiding at the sitting while on this journey. For the year 1789, fully a dozen conferences had been appointed. There was a complaint that this number was unnecessarily large, and that the sittings were too close together, some being not above 30 miles apart. But this objection could not be urged against those appointed for Georgia and South Carolina. On his way to the Georgia Conference, Asbury was again joined by Dr. Coke, who had landed, as in 1787, at Charleston. The two bishops traveled together from March until June, visiting all the conferences and closing their round in New York. At this conference, a memorable action was taken. In the year 1788, the federal Constitution had been promulgated, following which General Washington was elected to the presidency of the Republic. On April 30th, 1789, just 1 month before the conference, sitting in New York, the president-elect had taken the oath of office. Bishop Asbury, whose admiration for Washington was great, and suggested that the conference present to him a congratulatory address. The suggestion was cordially received, and the two bishops were appointed to write the address. This they did, and the same day it was adopted, and the bishops were commissioned to deliver it in person. General Washington, having been acquainted of the action of the conference by Reverend Thomas Morrill, the local pastor who had himself been an officer in the Revolutionary War, prepared a written response of similar length, and at a time appointed received the bishops and exchanged addresses with them. The function was a simple but most impressive one. Immediately after the close of the conference, Mr. Coke sailed again for Europe. It was understood that Mr. Wesley's great age and growing feebleness made it necessary for him to have his chief lieutenant constantly near him. Coke probably had other reasons for recrossing the Atlantic. His concerns were indeed so many and so worldwide, with the Wesleyan missions, and with connections in America and Great Britain, that he has been, not inaptly styled, the foreign minister of Methodism. It was during the early part of this year that Bishop Asbury received the famous letter from Wesley, the last communication he ever had from those venerable hands, in which the patriarch of Methodism, then in his 86th year, accused Asbury of seeking to make himself great. The letter had come of the refusal of the conference to elect Whatcoat to the episcopacy on Wesley's nomination, and of the rescinding of the rule of submission to Wesley's authority. Wesley had mistakenly held Asbury responsible for these actions, but from the charges he has been fully exonerated by his contemporaries. The fallacy of the arguments against the validity of Asbury's episcopacy, which high churchmen have grounded on this letter, has been so often exposed that no attention need be given it here. The conferences of the year agreed that the name of Mr. Wesley should again be given recognition in the minutes and the Book of Discipline. This recognition was not a restoration of the rule of submission, but was simply an acknowledgment of Wesley as a bishop emeritus of the American Church. According to Dr. Koch, the action was intended to recognize Mr. Wesley as the foundation of our episcopal office and the father of the whole work under the divine guidance. By under divine guidance, of course, they mean that they are making conclusions based on the Bible and the authority from Wesley they consider. In this relation, the name of Wesley continued to stand in the American minutes until he was called to the fellowship of the Church Triumphant. They mean his death, right? Although the preachers, with practical unanimity and with the expressed sympathy of Asbury, rejected Mr. Wesley's call for a general conference in 1787, the need of such a conference was great. Legislation could only be effected by carrying each measure proposed through a series of sittings. These sittings were considered to constitute one conference. The Baltimore sitting was the upper house, so to speak, where legislation was completed, and which had, up to and including the year 1787, a distinct power of confirmation. As the conference sittings multiplied, that method of lawmaking became increasingly more difficult and was every year productive of new chances of disunion. The Baltimore Conference, indeed, lost its primacy, and legislation got into the sittings haphazard and came out the same way. A general conference would no doubt have been called in 1787, except for the fear of the preachers that, in the event of the election of another American bishop, Mr. Wesley would call Asbury to Europe. Now that this danger was past, although the abrogation of Mr. Wesley's patriarchal authority, a majority favored the early convoking of a general conference. But strangely enough, Asbury opposed it. It is useless to inquire into Asbury's reasons for this opposition. It may or may not have grown out of a feeling that, as he was not a debater, he would be at a disadvantage when great contests arose in a body upon which there was absolutely no constitutional check. It is known that he feared a general moot of the preachers might result in radically altering the established discipline to which he was greatly attached. He felt the need of an easier concert, but he doubted the wisdom of reaching it at a bound. He had, in fact, another scheme for the government of the church. A body called the council, composed of the bishops and the presiding elders, was to be created and empowered to take over all matters of legislation and administrative affairs of the church under a limited veto left to each of the conferences. This scheme, although it came ostensibly from the two bishops, was almost wholly the work of Asbury. It was carried through the conferences in 1789 and ratified as the result of a strenuous insistency on the part of Asbury. The council had its first meeting in Baltimore, December 1st, 1789. The members recognized at once a fatal defect in its plan, which required absolute unanimity to carry a measure. Also, any rule vetoed by a conference suspended the rule in that district. The first step, therefore, taken by the councilors was to propose a material alteration of the restrictions laid upon them by the conferences. In a way, this is part of the spirit of an ecclesia, but to have your church, which is something a little bit different, have its rules be democratic like that, Material considerations of a rule, maybe, but the actual base rule itself, I don't know about that. This made it necessary to carry the whole matter through another round of sittings, being but little in favor of the preachers at first. This arbitrary action of its members provoked a criticism which prophesied for the council a stormy future. Well, if it can be deduced from regular material things, I don't prophecy. I'd relegate the term to talking about something directly from the spiritual realm, spiritually gifted, information. But I mean, intellectual philosophy is important, but it was indeed doomed to a brief and inglorious existence. But we may note the stages of its decline in their chronological order. History has placed a bar sinister on the escutcheon of James O'Kelly, one of the most gifted and aggressive of the early Methodist leaders. He was presiding elder in the Southern District of Virginia, and, by virtue of his office, was a member of the council. In position and influence in the church, he was second only to Asbury. At the council session, he took umbrage at the rulings of the bishop, but he probably harbored an older, more general resentment. In January 1790, he addressed Asbury a letter in which he brought against him heavy complaints of usurpation. And tyranny. This was the opening gun of the famous O'Kelly controversy, which finally resulted in O'Kelly's leaving the church and establishing an abortive organization known as the Republican Methodists, or the Church of the O'Kellyites. A fair picture of what lay before the pioneer bishop in 1790 may be had by mentally organizing his circuit from these facts. 14 conferences were to be attended, and these were sprinkled over the face of a vast triangle whose apex reached to the faraway wildernesses of Georgia, and whose base extended from New York City to a point in Kentucky settlements not far from the present-day city of Lexington. The time of these sittings reached from February 15th to October 4th, and the distance around the mighty course was a little short of 4,000 miles. 5 times during that long ride, the bishop crossed the Appalachian Mountains and swam the swollen rivers that poured through their valleys, but the joy of an apostle filled his heart while he carried the burden of caring for all the churches. Well, happiness and distress are not really the point, but be happy with your role in life. That's certainly important. Many were the perils he met, and many the strange stories he heard, as he and the faithful Watcoat, who was his traveling companion much of the year, pressed on in tireless enterprise. They were often on and near the Indian lands, and in Kentucky heard rumors of freshly perpetrated atrocities. The graves of many victims of the red man's rage were shown them. Well, if you move in and take over people's livelihood and stuff like that, there's ways to do immigration and there was definitely issues with how immigration was dealt with in America. I mean, to form America. At one stage in their return journey, they were escorted by a company of armed frontiersmen who traveled together for mutual protection. The heaviest concern of Bishop Asbury this year was for the council. It was coming in for criticism on every hand. A few of the conferences gave it scant toleration, but for the most part it was practically reprobated. At some of the sittings, the weary bishop did not have the heart to so much as mention it, and it was now plain to him that its days were numbered. But if his cherished dream of church government was disappointed, he found compensation in reflecting upon the progress of the work. The continent flamed with revival. The interest of the former year in Virginia had spread southward, northward, and westward. As the preachers came into the conferences, they brought the glow of it on their souls. When they departed, it was with augmented zeal. This was the year in which the Sunday school movement was formally recognized by conference action. But Wesley had used the Sunday school long before this in his work in England. Asbury was also at this time projecting primary schools in North Carolina, Georgia, and Kentucky. While in Kentucky, he raised a subscription of $1,500 for a school in that territory to be known as Bethel. This enterprise became a source of much worry to him at a later day, and he named it Miniature Cokesbury. Other schools, especially the one in North Carolina and a latter enterprise in Pennsylvania, as also one in Virginia called the Ebenezer Academy, had happier histories. It is worthy of note also that the school which he still later projected in South Carolina survives today in that splendid institution known as Wofford College. This book's from, 111 years ago, so I'm not sure about all these statements as being contemporary, but the episcopal labors of the year were practically closed with the presidency over a second session of the council, which was held December 1st, and, as before in Baltimore, besides considering its own difficult situation, the council did little except to recommend a loan of $5,000 for Cokesbury College. It adjourned to meet again in December 1792, but it never reassembled. The general conference of that year displaced it and inherited all its functions and many more. Dr. Coke was scheduled to reach Charleston from Europe by way of the West Indies about the middle of February 1791. The first conference of the year was to be held in Charleston, and the two bishops were then to take the round of the connection together. For this reason, the 12 sittings named for the year were to be held at points east of the mountains, and so arranged that the last should fall at midsummer. Dr. Coke suffered shipwreck off Edisto Light, but arrived in time to attend the conference, bringing with him William Hammett, an erratic and gifted young Irish preacher, whose sermons so captivated the Methodists of Charleston that they asked, and then demanded, that he be given them as pastor. This request Asbury flatly declined to consider. A bitter personal controversy arose over the incident. Hammett followed Asbury to Philadelphia and made a determined effort to secure the Charleston pulpit. Failing in this, he returned to Charleston. divided the congregation, and established an independent church to which he ministered until his death a few years later. Now, if you're okay with the church, but you're just like, well, I don't have as strong of authority, so I'm going to found my own church. I think one of the ancestors of my family did the same thing. They, the Bible doesn't support divorce, and he was divorced, so they thought he couldn't be. The Christian side of the Bible doesn't allow for divorce, so being divorced, they limited his position, and he went off and funded his, he dropped funding and went off and had his own church founded. Dr. Koch had come to America determined, as had been supposed, to put an end to the council and call a general conference. The meeting between him and Asbury was, therefore, not so cordial as had been their former associations, but Asbury showed his sincerity of purpose and his devotion to the church by surrendering without a contest and agreeing to a general conference. The two bishops had proceeded in their joint superintendency of the conference through Georgia and the Carolinas, and were at the second or Hanover session in Virginia. When they received the melancholy news of the death of Mr. Wesley, Dr. Koch hurried at once to Baltimore that he might take the first ship to England, and left Bishop Asbury to complete the visitations of the year alone, being detained in Baltimore over Sabbath. And we don't mean the 8 times a year one, and I don't think we mean the biblical one of sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. Probably just Sunday. Mr. Koch was asked to preach a sermon in memory of Mr. Wesley. In this discourse, he was indiscreet enough to suggest that the founder's death had been hastened by the action of the American Conference in rescinding the rule of submission, although the unreasonableness of this supposition was apparent. It had the effect of further chilling the effect of the Americans for the great and gifted man whom they had received half a dozen years before as their ecclesiastical liberator, and whom they had gladly accepted as their first bishop. The plan of the conferences for the year afforded Asbury an opportunity to take up a long-cherished enterprise, namely a personal survey of New England as a field for Methodism. In the previous year, Jesse Lee, burning with desire for the mission, had been made presiding elder of a prospective New England district, and had been given 3 or 4 helpers, 2 of them veterans. With these he had invaded the land of steady habits and Calvinistic theology. A beginning had been made, and the work was to be immediately reinforced. Now, I understand and agree with the idea that things should be supported. But if you can't find explicit mention of something, that doesn't mean it's forbidden. If something's explicitly mentioned as forbidden, now, by explicit, I mean, it's like if they say don't use intoxicants except for survival, well, do they list coffee and cigarettes and heroin and all this? Well, no, they don't list them in such references, but then again, they do by the words they use. Beginning had been made and the work was being immediately reinforced. I mean, that's what comes to mind. And just like in America, so many of our offenders are statute offenders rather than, thieves and stuff that, you don't need specific laws to know better. Or, if extramarital sex is to be punished, that's consensual, well, then all of it would be punished, right? Or none of it. It just doesn't make sense in between, except as a thing of filling jails and stuff. Asbury made exceptional preparations for his New England journey. The country was old, and the highways were good. Instead of the usual horseback advance, he decided to go on wheels and secured a chaise for his use. In company with Jesse Lee, he set out from New York about June 1st. A number of the principal cities were visited, including Newport, Providence, Hartford, New Haven, Boston, Lynn, and Salem. In all these, he delivered sermons, and in a few instances met with cordial treatment, but, generally speaking, he was accorded scant courtesy by the representatives of other churches. His rather disparaging estimate of the type of religion he found may have been unconsciously influenced by something besides theological judgment. Although he saw little that was accomplished by his personal mission, he returned feeling that at an early day Methodism would come into its own even in the land of the Presbyterians, as he termed the Calvinistic Congregationalists, whose altars were still supported by appropriations from the state legislators. Okay, yeah, it does say that. He believed that Arminian Methodism would find tinder among the decrees. The following year, his faith was rewarded by tidings of a revival which began under his preachers in Connecticut. The center of this awakening was at Hartford, where that remarkable man, Hope Hull, was in charge. It was during this revival that a lad of 13 or 14 years joined in society under Hull and latter asked for license as a preacher. This lad was the famous and erratic Lorenzo Doe, whose sermons and meteoric dashes from the Canadas to Mississippi and back were one of the sensations of the early years of the 19th century. The conferences, 18 in number for the round of 1792, began early, the first two being held before Christmas in 1791. These visitations, which the bishop found it necessary to complete by the end of September, must have represented in the aggregate nearly 5,000 miles, in addition to taking in the stations in Georgia, Holston, and Kentucky. He held a conference in Lynn, and thus a second time compassed nearly the whole of New England. It was to him a year of great stress. At the height of it, he made this entry in his journal: "How much I have suffered in this journey is only known to God and myself." Well, suffering and difficulty aren't quite the same thing, are they?